Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Before we step back into the gaslit, shadow-filled world of the 19th century, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're settled in for the night, seeking a peaceful end to a long day, or simply wish to unwind with a story from the past, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me. If you feel inclined, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. It's always a delight to see where our shared love for history takes us. And if you enjoy this style of calm, immersive storytelling, please consider subscribing so we can journey together again. But for now, let's allow the noise of our own time to fade away. Let's allow the frantic pace of the modern world to slow to a gentle walking rhythm. Let us travel back to an era not so long ago, a time of great progress and invention, a time of steam and steel, but also an era utterly, profoundly, and beautifully obsessed with one of life's greatest certainties: death. Picture yourself in Victorian England. The air is thick with the smoke of industry. The streets bustle with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. But beneath this veneer of modernity lies a deep, complex, and all-encompassing relationship with the end of life. This was a time when grief wasn't just a private emotion to be dealt with behind closed doors. It was a public spectacle, a social duty, a performance governed by a set of rules so intricate, so specific, and so demanding that they shaped every facet of a person's existence, from the clothes they wore to the food they ate, to the very paper on which they wrote their letters. The Victorian era, which we generally define by the long reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, was a period of profound contradiction. This was the age of Darwin, of industrial revolution, of groundbreaking scientific discovery. Life expectancy, for the first time in history, was steadily rising. And yet, death was an ever-present, almost tangible reality. It was in every home. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high, even in wealthy families. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and consumption, what we now know as tuberculosis, could sweep through a city with terrifying speed, respecting no social class. Death was not an abstract concept relegated to hospitals and old age. It was a familiar visitor, an empty chair at the dinner table, a sudden and devastating silence in the nursery. This constant proximity to death fostered not a fear of it in the way we might understand, but a deep and abiding fascination. It was a subject to be explored, understood, sentimentalized, and above all, managed. It was a deeply religious society, and for many, death was not an end, but a glorious transition, a journey to a heavenly reward where they would be blissfully reunited with their departed loved ones. This belief gave death a certain romantic, even beautiful quality. Hymns and poems spoke of death as a gentle release, of angels carrying souls to a better place. But this was also the age of science, of doubt, of questioning. And in the space between unwavering faith and creeping uncertainty, a unique culture blossomed. A culture that sought to control the uncontrollable. A culture that sought to manage death, to codify it, to turn the wild, untamable chaos of grief into an ordered, predictable, and socially acceptable process. At the heart of this obsession, the silent, black-clad figure who defined the era's relationship with sorrow was Queen Victoria herself. But it would be a mistake to think this intricate culture of mourning sprang from nowhere. The Georgians and the Romantics who came before the Victorians had already laid the groundwork. cultivating a sentimental appreciation for melancholy and remembrance. But the Victorians, with their characteristic love for order, for etiquette, for industrial efficiency, would take these existing traditions and refine them, expand upon them, and turn them into a veritable art form, a complex and all-consuming social science. The true catalyst for this explosion in mourning culture, the event that turned a set of customs into a national obsession, was, ironically, a great love story. Queen Victoria's marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a genuine and passionate partnership. He was not just her husband, he was her closest advisor, her confidant, her everything. When he died suddenly from what was likely typhoid fever in 1861, at the age of just 42, Victoria's world collapsed. Her grief was not quiet, it was not private, it was absolute and all-consuming. She famously told her daughter, "The joy of my life is gone. The life of my life is gone." And she meant it. She retreated from public life almost entirely, entering a state of seclusion that lasted for decades, earning her the nickname, the Widow of Windsor. For the remaining 40 years of her life, she wore black. She commissioned countless memorials to him, from statues and buildings to the Grand Royal Albert Hall and the Albert Memorial in London. Her palaces became shrines to his memory. His rooms were kept exactly as he had left them, with hot water brought up each morning for his shave, and fresh clothes laid out each day as if he were still there. Her grief was not a phase, it became her identity. And because she was the queen, her personal sorrow set the standard for the entire nation, and indeed much of the Western world. In an age where showing excessive emotion was often seen as a sign of weakness or poor breeding, the queen made grief fashionable. Her profound, unending sorrow became the template, and society, ever eager to emulate the monarchy, followed suit with a devotion that was both sincere and socially necessary. An entire industry, a vast and profitable economy of death, bloomed in the long, dark shadow of this royal grief. One of the most startling and intimate customs that flourished during this period was post-mortem photography. In an era before the snapshot, before the Kodak Brownie made photography cheap and accessible to all, the death of a loved one, particularly a child, was often the first and only time a family would consider commissioning a photograph. It might be the only visual record they ever had of their child's face. Photographers who specialized in this delicate art were called to the home to capture a final likeness. These were not gruesome or macabre images of death. They were carefully, lovingly staged portraits designed to create a beautiful and lasting memory. They were meant to capture an image of peaceful repose, a final slumber. The deceased were often posed as if they were merely sleeping. A baby would be placed in its crib, tucked in with its favorite toys, its face peaceful and at rest. An older child might be posed on a sofa, perhaps with a book in their lap, or seated in a chair alongside their living siblings. In these family portraits, the living and the dead would pose together, their gazes fixed on the camera, a final, poignant family portrait. The mother might hold her sleeping child one last time, her arm wrapped protectively around them, her expression a mask of stoic sorrow. The living siblings might stand solemnly beside the chair where their brother or sister sits, their faces a mixture of confusion and grief. Sometimes the photographer would use subtle props, like a drooping flower in the deceased's hand, to symbolize a life cut short, or a pocket watch with the hands stopped. In some of the earliest and most heartbreaking examples, the photographer even delicately painted open eyes onto the photographic plate to give the illusion of life. To our modern eyes, accustomed to hiding death away, these images can be deeply unsettling. But to the Victorians, they were a profound and final act of remembrance. They were a way to preserve the image of a loved one, to capture their form before it was consigned to the earth. They were talismans against the fading of memory, a beautiful, heartbreaking, and tangible connection to a soul that had departed. They called these images memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning, "Remember you must die," a constant reminder of the fragility of life, but also a powerful testament to the endurance of love. This very human desire to keep a physical piece of the deceased with you, to have something tangible to hold on to, led to another deeply personal and intricate craft: hair jewelry. A lock of hair was often the last living part of a person. Unlike the body, hair did not decay. It retained its color and texture for centuries. It became a powerful, almost sacred relic of the person themselves. The practice of keeping locks of hair was not new, but the Victorians, with their love for intricate craft and symbolism, elevated it to an art form. Jewelers, known as hair weavers, would take these precious locks of hair and intricately weave, braid, and curl them into astonishingly complex and beautiful designs. These woven hair patterns, sometimes resembling delicate floral sprays, weeping willows, or abstract knots, were then placed inside lockets, brooches, rings, and bracelets, preserved forever under glass. A widow might wear a large, somber brooch containing an elaborate design woven from her husband's graying hair, worn directly over her heart. A mother could commission a delicate ring, a tiny woven flower made from the golden first curl of a child she had lost. Sometimes, the hair of an entire family, living and dead, would be woven together into a single, multicolored piece, a genealogical tapestry worn as a bracelet or displayed in a frame. These were not just morbid trinkets, they were works of art, crafted with incredible patience and skill. They were imbued with the most profound emotional significance, a way to carry a physical part of a loved one with you, to feel their presence long after they were gone. But mourning was not just about personal keepsakes and private grief. It was, first and foremost, a rigid and complex social code, an elaborate performance with a strict script and costumes. And the lead role in this drama was always played by the women. The rules of mourning etiquette were laid out in exhaustive detail in popular ladies' magazines and household manuals like The Queen and Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. These guides dictated everything: what you wore, what you ate, who you could see, what you could read, and for precisely how long. The complexity was staggering, with different rules for mourning a spouse versus a parent, or a sibling versus a child, or even an in-law versus a distant cousin. Society was a stage, and grief was a role one had to play perfectly. For a widow, the period of deep mourning, or first mourning, was the most intense and socially isolating. It was expected to last for a year and a day, a duration with ancient, superstitious roots. During this time, her entire world was shrouded in the deepest, dullest black. She was required to wear a dress made of a non-reflective, matte black fabric called bombazine, a mix of silk and wool, often trimmed with the stiff, scratchy, and deeply uncomfortable fabric known as crepe. The physical discomfort of the crepe, its weight and texture, was intentional, meant to be a constant physical reminder of the emotional pain of grief. Over this dress, she wore a long, heavy black veil made of the same oppressive crepe that completely obscured her face from public view. This veil, known as a weeping veil, effectively erased her from the social world. It signaled her deep sorrow and her complete withdrawal from the normal course of life. She was not to attend parties, balls, the theater, or any form of entertainment. Her social life, for a full year, ceased to exist. She was, in essence, a social ghost, a walking symbol of her loss, a living memento mori for all to see. After the first grueling year, she was permitted to transition into second mourning, which lasted for about 9 months. The heavy, scratchy crepe could be discarded for black fabrics with a slight sheen, like silk, satin, or velvet. The thick weeping veil could be lifted from her face or replaced with a shorter one. She could cautiously begin to re-enter society, perhaps attending small, quiet gatherings, though still marked by the solemnity of her grief. Finally, after roughly 2 years of visible sorrow, she could enter half mourning. This final stage, lasting another 3 to 6 months, allowed for the slow reintroduction of muted colors into her wardrobe. Gray, mauve, lavender, lilac, and white were considered acceptable. It was a gradual return to the world of the living, a slow, carefully managed re-emergence from the shadows of grief. For a woman to deviate from this strict timeline was to risk social ruin. To wear colors too soon was seen as a sign of disrespect for the dead and a shocking lack of moral fiber. For men, the rules were, unsurprisingly, far less restrictive. A widower was only expected to wear a simple black suit, black gloves, and a black hatband for a period of 3 months to a year. After that, he was completely free to remarry and resume his normal life. This stark double standard reflected the Victorian view of women as the more emotional and spiritual sex, the designated keepers of the family's memory and sorrow. It was their sacred duty to perform the family's grief for all the world to see. The entire household of the deceased was expected to participate in these rituals. Upon a death in the house, a servant would be dispatched to the undertaker. All the curtains in the house were drawn, and often clocks were stopped at the time of death. Mirrors were covered with black cloth, partly out of an old superstition that the soul of the deceased could become trapped in the reflection, and partly to avoid the vanity of looking at oneself during a time of grief. Even the family's writing paper had to be changed. All letters sent from the house of mourning had to be written on stationery with a thick black border. The width of this border was prescribed, and it would decrease in thickness as the mourning period progressed, signaling to the recipient the family's stage of grief. This demand for mourning paraphernalia created a booming industry. So-called mourning warehouses sprang up in every major city. These were vast department stores dedicated solely to selling everything one could possibly need for a funeral and the subsequent period of grief. Shops like Jay's of Regent Street in London became famous for their speed and efficiency, able to provide a complete, custom-fitted mourning wardrobe for an entire family, including the servants, on a moment's notice. From black-edged handkerchiefs and jet-black jewelry to special mourning parasols, fans, and bonnets, grief was commercialized and sold as a complete package. The funeral itself was the grand centerpiece of this public display of sorrow, an elaborate and costly piece of social theater. The splendor of a funeral was a direct reflection of the social status of the deceased and their family. For the wealthy, it was a mag. For the wealthy, it was a magnificent and somber spectacle. A team of professional undertakers would take over the home, their movements practiced and solemn. The body would be laid out in the finest room for viewing, in a polished coffin of oak or mahogany, lined with silk. The hearse was a work of art in itself, a carved and glazed carriage drawn by a team of perfectly matched black horses. These horses were draped in black velvet coverings called palls, and their heads were adorned with tall, swaying black ostrich plumes. The number of plumes was highly significant. It was a visible marker of wealth and status. Professional mourners, known as mutes, often local men paid to look sad, could be hired to stand sentinel at the door of the house or walk alongside the hearse, their faces fixed in expressions of profound sorrow. The funeral procession would wind slowly through the streets, a public parade of grief for all to see. For the working classes, a funeral was a source of great financial anxiety. The cost of even a simple funeral could be ruinous, plunging a family into debt for years. To avoid the ultimate social shame of a pauper's funeral, a simple burial in an unmarked common grave, most working-class families joined burial clubs. These were a form of insurance where members would pay a small amount each week into a common fund. This fund would then ensure that when a member died, their family would have the money for a dignified funeral, with a proper coffin, a hearse, and a decent burial plot. The fear of a pauper's burial was a powerful motivator. A decent funeral was the last and most important social duty one could perform for a family member. It was a final act of love and respect that transcended the poverty of their daily lives. This constant, visible presence of death also gave rise to a powerful countercurrent, a deep and abiding fascination with spiritualism and the possibility of contacting the dead. The spiritualist movement, which began in America in the mid-19th century, found fertile ground in the grief-stricken society of Victorian Britain. The movement claimed that it was possible for the living to communicate with the spirits of the dead, usually through a gifted individual known as a medium, during a gathering called a séance. For those desperate for one last word with a lost child, or a final message from a departed spouse, séances offered immense comfort and a sense of hope that was almost intoxicating. In the darkened parlors of Victorian homes, families would sit around a heavy table, holding hands, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The medium, often a woman, would enter a trance-like state. What followed was a piece of carefully managed theater. Rapping sounds would emanate from the walls, tables would levitate, musical instruments would play on their own, and ghostly ethereal forms, made of a substance called ectoplasm, might appear in the darkness. The medium would relay messages from the spirit world, often vague but filled with comforting words of love and reassurance. While many mediums were later exposed as clever frauds, using trickery and illusion to create their effects, for countless grieving Victorians, the belief that they could speak to their departed family members was a powerful and essential part of their mourning process. It filled a spiritual void and offered what they saw as scientific proof that life, in some form, continued after death. But as the 19th century wore on, a weariness began to set in. Some began to question the rigid and oppressive nature of the mourning rituals. The immense expense, the social pressure, the prolonged and isolating performance of grief all started to feel excessive and unhealthy. A reform movement began to advocate for simpler, more sanitary, and less ostentatious funerals. The practice of cremation, long considered pagan by the Christian Church, was slowly reintroduced as a more hygienic and practical alternative to the dangerously overcrowded city graveyards. The heavy, unhygienic crepe fabrics of mourning were criticized by doctors as being unhealthy for the wearer. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. The death of King Edward VII in 1910, Queen Victoria's son, marked a significant symbolic turning point. His queen, Alexandra, a fashion icon of her day, chose to wear elegant and beautiful white and mauve mourning gowns at his funeral. It was a stark and beautiful departure from the heavy, oppressive black that her mother-in-law had made famous. The spell was broken. However, it was the cataclysm of the First World War that would deliver the final, shattering blow to the elaborate mourning culture of the Victorians. When death came on such an industrial, unimaginable scale, when an entire generation of young men was lost on the battlefields of France, the old, personalized rituals seemed inadequate, even hollow. There was no time for 2-year mourning periods for a single person when grief was a national, collective, and unending experience. The private, performative sorrow of the 19th century gave way to the shared, public memorials of the 20th century. The culture of death had been irrevocably changed, and so the world of the Victorian mourner faded into history, leaving behind a legacy of beautiful, strange, and somber artifacts. The post-mortem photographs, the intricate hair jewelry, the black-edged letters, they are all windows into a time when death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but was an integrated, visible, and central part of life. It was an era that understood the profound human need to remember, to honor, and to give shape to the formless, overwhelming nature of grief. While their methods may seem strange, even morbid to us, the emotions they expressed are timeless. The love for a lost child, the sorrow for a departed spouse, the desperate desire to keep a part of them with us, these are feelings that connect us to them across the centuries. So the next time you see a sepia-toned photograph from the 19th century, look closely at the faces. See the formal postures, the serious expressions, and remember the world they lived in. A world of incredible change and progress, but also a world where the shadow of death was a constant, and in some ways, a comforting companion. Remember their elaborate rules and their beautiful, heartfelt rituals. And above all, remember that their complex relationship with death was born from a very simple and very human place, the desire to never truly let go of those they loved. And with that, dear listener, our journey into the somber world of Victorian mourning comes to a close. I hope these stories of ritual and remembrance have offered a new perspective on a time long past. May you find comfort in your own memories, and may you always cherish the connections that bind us to one another, in life and beyond. Thank you for joining me in this quiet corner of history. If you enjoyed our time together, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe and share these tales. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. But for now, I'll bid you a fond good night. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams. The Victorian obsession with death was not merely a social phenomenon, it was a deeply personal one, felt in every home. When a death occurred, the household transformed. The body of the deceased was not immediately taken away by a funeral director. Instead, it remained in the house, often for several days, in the best room, for a period known as the viewing or the wake. Family, friends, and neighbors would come to pay their respects, to sit with the body, and to offer condolences to the grieving family. This was a time of shared sorrow. The deceased was attended to by the women of the family, who would wash the body and dress it in its best clothes. It was an intimate and final act of care. The room would be kept cool, and often flowers and herbs were used to mask any unpleasant odors. This proximity to death, which seems so alien to us today, was a natural part of the grieving process for the Victorians. It allowed for a slow, personal farewell. The fear of being buried alive was a very real and pervasive anxiety during the 19th century. Medical science was still in its infancy, and accurately determining the moment of death was not always straightforward. Newspapers were filled with sensational stories of people waking up in their coffins. This led to the invention of safety coffins, designed with mechanisms to allow an accidentally buried person to signal for help. Some had a bell on the surface connected by a string to the deceased's hand. Others had a system of ladders and breathing tubes. While there is little evidence that these devices ever actually saved anyone, their popularity speaks volumes about the anxieties of the age. The rise of spiritualism in the mid-19th century offered another way for the Victorians to cope with loss. The movement claimed that it was possible to communicate with the spirits of the dead through a medium at a séance. For those desperate to contact a lost loved one, séances offered immense comfort and a sense of hope. In darkened parlors, families would sit around a table holding hands, while a medium would claim to channel messages from the spirit world. Knocking sounds, floating tables, and ghostly apparitions were all part of the performance. While many mediums were later exposed as frauds for countless grieving Victorians, the belief that they could speak to their departed family members was a powerful and essential part of their mourning process. It filled a spiritual void and offered proof that life, in some form, continued after death. The symbolism of flowers became an intricate language of grief. A funeral wreath was not just a decoration. Every flower had a specific meaning. Rosemary was for remembrance, cypress for mourning, and lilies for the restored innocence of the soul. The color and type of flowers used would convey a specific message about the deceased and the nature of the family's grief. This language of flowers allowed the Victorians to express complex emotions that their strict social etiquette often forced them to suppress. A carefully chosen bouquet could say more than words ever could. Even the cemeteries themselves were transformed during the Victorian era. The old, crowded churchyards were replaced by new, beautifully landscaped, garden cemeteries on the outskirts of cities. These were designed to be peaceful, park-like spaces where families could come to visit their loved ones' graves, have a picnic, and spend the day in quiet contemplation. The gravestones became more elaborate, adorned with sculptures of weeping angels, draped urns, and other symbols of sorrow and remembrance. Cemeteries were not just places for the dead. They were public spaces for the living to actively participate in the culture of memory. The sheer weight of all these rituals, the expense, the social pressure, could be immense. In her diaries, one Victorian woman wrote of her exhaustion and frustration with the demands of mourning. "One is not allowed to heal," she wrote. "One is forced to perform sorrow, to wear it like a heavy cloak until the shoulders ache. I long for a simple ray of sunshine, for a color other than black, but society forbids it." This sentiment grew throughout the latter part of the century, as people began to feel that the rituals designed to honor the dead were, in fact, placing an unbearable burden on the living. The pendulum had swung from a natural, integrated approach to death to a rigid, oppressive, and commercialized one. The end of the era brought a return to a more private, less performative style of grieving. But the legacy of the Victorians remains. They left us with a fascinating and at times unsettling portrait of a society trying to make sense of mortality. Their elaborate and often beautiful attempts to hold on to the dead remind us of the universal human impulse to remember, to honor, and to love, even after a final goodbye. They created a culture where death was not a taboo, but a part of life, a dark thread woven into the very fabric of their society. And in that, there is a strange and somber beauty. As we nestle into our warm beds, let us spare a thought for those who lived in a world so draped in black, who loved so fiercely that they created an entire art form out of saying goodbye. May their memory bring us a sense of peace, and may our own dreams be filled with light. Good night.